A man died alone in a castle in 1798, convinced nobody would remember his name. He'd spent the last 9 years writing furiously, 13 hours a day, racing against death to record a life so extraordinary that even he worried people would call him a liar. His name was Giacomo Casanova, and his story makes every modern celebrity look boring by comparison. Venice, 1725. The city was dying, but nobody wanted to admit it. The 1,000-year-old empire that once controlled Mediterranean trade was hemorrhaging power to the Ottomans and Austrians. But if you had money, Venice still knew how to help you spend it. This was the pleasure capital of Europe, where masks weren't just for carnival, but for every evening you wanted to pretend you were someone else. Where churches stood next to gambling houses, and nobody saw the contradiction. April 2nd, a baby was born in the narrow Calle Malipiero in the San Samuele district. His mother, Zanetta Ferrucci, was an actress. His legal father, Gaetano Casanova, was an actor and dancer. But there's a stone plaque on that wall today, and locals will tell you something everyone suspected back then. The real father was probably the wealthy owner of the San Samuele Theatre, where both parents performed. Theatre owners had privileges. Actresses had few options. The boy they named Giacomo was the first of 6 children. Francesco Giuseppe arrived in 1727, Giovanni Battista in 1730. Then 3 more siblings crowding into poverty. Being firstborn meant nothing when your parents barely acknowledged your existence. Giacomo's earliest memory wasn't of his mother's face or his father's voice. He claimed he remembered nothing before age 8, when his grandmother dragged him to Murano to see a witch. The nosebleeds wouldn't stop. Blood on his pillow every morning. Blood on his shirts. Blood that terrified his grandmother enough to seek magic rather than medicine. The witch performed her ritual. The nosebleeds continued, but something about that moment seared itself into his consciousness. The first memory, desperation, blood, and someone trying to fix him with methods that made no sense. His 9th birthday brought a gift he never forgot. His mother packed his belongings and shipped him to a boarding house in Padua. Just sent him away. In his memoirs, written decades later when he'd become one of the most famous men in Europe, Casanova wrote with unmistakable bitterness, "In this way did my family get rid of me." Nobody was, so the 9-year-old did what? Nobody was, so the 9-year-old did what would become his signature move throughout life. He found someone with power and made himself useful. Abbe Gozzi became his tutor, teaching him Latin, Greek, mathematics, and violin. In the Gozzi household, Giacomo discovered something that would shape everything that followed. The Abbe had a younger sister named Bettina. She was pretty, loved romance novels, and at age 11, Giacomo experienced his first sexual encounter when she fondled him. He never forgot Bettina. Decades later, after countless lovers across Europe, he still wrote about her with tenderness. This is where the man who would become synonymous with seduction started, not with confidence or technique, but with abandonment and a desperate hunger for connection that would drive him for 73 years. The University of Padua accepted students young. Giacomo entered at 12. While other boys his age were still learning basic arithmetic, he was studying law, moral philosophy, chemistry, and mathematics. He graduated at 17 with a laurea in law, a degree he later called the subject of his unconquerable aversion. But law wasn't the point. University was where he learned to think, to argue, to recognize patterns others missed. It was also where he discovered gambling, the thrill of risk, the mathematics of probability, the psychological warfare across a card table. He got into debt immediately. His grandmother summoned him back to Venice. The debts were paid. The gambling continued. Some lessons you never learn because you don't want to. Back in Venice, 17-year-old Giacomo transformed himself. He was tall and dark, with long hair he powdered and curled with obsessive care. He learned to move through rooms like he belonged there, to speak with the confidence of someone who had every right to exist in spaces that should have excluded him. Fake it until you make it wasn't a modern concept. It was survival strategy in a society where birth determined everything. Senator Alvise Gasparo Malipiero was 76 years old and owned Palazzo Malipiero. He also moved in the highest circles of Venetian nobility, knew everyone worth knowing, and understood that a young man with wits and hunger could be useful. Malipiero took Giacomo under his wing, teaching him about wine, food, manners, and how power actually worked versus how people pretended it worked. The education ended abruptly when Malipiero caught his young protégé with Teresa Imma, an actress the senator had been pursuing. Malipiero threw them both out, but the damage was done. Giacomo had learned what he needed to know: how to talk, how to dress, how to move. The rest he'd figure out on his own. At 17, while supposedly studying for the priesthood, Giacomo had his first complete sexual experience. 2 sisters, Nanetta and Martin Savognan, ages 14 and 16, distant relatives of the powerful Grimani family. What happened between them destroyed any possibility of Casanova becoming a priest. Years later, he wrote, "My love proved fatal to me, because from it sprang 2 other love affairs, which, in their turn, gave birth to a great many others, and caused me finally to renounce the church as a profession." He'd found what he was good at, and it wasn't prayer, but here's what's easy to miss if you only know Casanova as a seducer. The man was brilliant, genuinely, undeniably intelligent in ways that had nothing to do with charm or manipulation. He spoke Italian, French, Latin, and Greek fluently. He'd studied mathematics seriously enough to later discuss probability theory with some of the greatest minds in Europe. He understood medicine well enough to diagnose and treat illnesses, despite never completing formal medical training. And he had something rarer than intelligence. He had timing. February 1746. Giacomo was walking through Venice when he saw a red-robed senator collapse in the street, clutching his chest. Everyone else froze. Heart attacks were death sentences. You called a priest, not a doctor, but Giacomo rushed forward, helped the man home, and stayed at his side even after physicians and family arrived. He talked to the senator, kept him calm, refused to leave. The senator survived. His name was Matteo Bragadin, and he was one of the most powerful men in Venice. When he recovered, Bragadin declared that this young man had saved his life. More than that, Bragadin believed Giacomo possessed some kind of mystical power, some connection to forces beyond normal understanding. Casanova was smart enough not to correct him. If a wealthy, connected nobleman wanted to believe you had magical abilities, you nodded and looked mysterious. Bragadin essentially adopted him, not legally, but practically. Giacomo moved into the senator's palazzo, received an allowance, and suddenly had access to wealth and influence that should have been impossible for an actor's son. He attended parties with the Venetian elite, gambled with nobles, and learned that society's rules were more flexible than anyone admitted. If you had the right patron, if you knew how to make yourself valuable, doors opened. But patronage is a trap. It gives you everything except freedom. You're always performing, always aware that your position depends on someone else's goodwill. One wrong move, one moment where you forget your place, and it all disappears. Casanova was 21 and restless. Venice was too small, too predictable. He'd learned everything he could from Bragadin, mastered the social games, and started to feel the walls closing in. The city that had raised him was becoming a prison. He tried different careers like someone flipping through channels, worked briefly for a cardinal in Rome, became a violinist in a theatre orchestra, joined the military for approximately 5 minutes before realizing he hated taking orders. Each attempt taught him something: how the church really operated, how artists survived, how soldiers thought. But nothing stuck because nothing satisfied the fundamental hunger that drove him. He needed more experiences, more knowledge, more women, more life than any single city or profession could provide. The 18th century was the age of the Grand Tour, when wealthy young men travelled Europe to complete their education. Casanova would take that concept and stretch it beyond recognition, spending the next 40 years covering more than 40,000 miles across the continent. But first, he needed a reason to leave Venice, and in 1749, that reason found him. Her name was never recorded. What we know is that she was Venetian, probably married, definitely from a family with influence. What we know is that the affair became public in exactly the wrong way, creating a scandal that made Venice uncomfortable for Casanova. Bragadin's protection could only stretch so far. Sometimes the best solution is strategic disappearance. Casanova left Venice and headed east. Constantinople first, because why not start with one of the most exotic cities in the world? He was 24, had enough money to travel in style, and carried letters of introduction that opened doors. The Ottoman Empire was everything Venice wasn't. Alien, vast, operating under completely different rules. He loved it. But Constantinople was just the beginning. Over the next few years, he would travel to Corfu, back to Venice briefly, then up to Germany and France. Each city taught him something new. How to read people across cultural barriers. How to identify opportunity disguised as conversation. How to disappear when necessary and reappear somewhere else with a new story. In Lyon, 1750, something significant happened. Casanova joined the Freemasons. This wasn't just social climbing, though it was that too. Freemasonry in the 18th century attracted the intellectual elite, men interested in philosophy, science, and ideas that couldn't always be discussed openly. The secret rituals appealed to Casanova's sense of drama, but more importantly, membership gave him access to a network that spanned Europe. Masonic brothers helped each other, provided introductions, opened doors. It was the LinkedIn of the Enlightenment, except with more candlelight and mysterious symbols. Casanova also started claiming he was a Rosicrucian and an alchemist. Was he? Probably not in any real sense. But alchemy was wildly popular among the nobility, particularly the search for the philosopher's stone that could supposedly turn lead into gold. Nobles would pay enormous sums to anyone who claimed special knowledge. Casanova recognized a market opportunity when he saw one. He became an expert at seeming to know more than he did. Drop a few Latin phrases, reference some obscure text, perform a ritual that looked impressive, and suddenly you're a master of hidden wisdom. The con only works if you're smart enough to maintain it, and Casanova was absolutely smart enough. He never promised results he couldn't deliver. He just suggested possibilities, created atmosphere, and let wealthy people convince themselves. This period of his life reads like a picaresque novel because that's essentially what he was living. Each city brought new adventures, new lovers, new narrow escapes from angry husbands or suspicious authorities. Paris in 1750, where he made connections that would matter later. Vienna, where he charmed his way into aristocratic circles. Back to Venice in 1753 because he missed home and thought enough time had passed. He was wrong about that last part. Venice hadn't forgotten him, and the Venetian inquisitors were starting to pay attention. Because while Casanova had been travelling and learning and seducing his way across Europe, he'd also been doing something more dangerous. He'd been thinking, and in the 18th century, thinking the wrong thoughts could get you imprisoned or worse. The inquisitors had files on him. They knew about his claims to magical knowledge, his association with Freemasons, his casual disregard for religious orthodoxy. They were building a case, waiting for the right moment. That moment came in 1755. Casanova was 30 years old, established in Venice, confident in Bragadin's continued protection. He'd gotten comfortable. That's always when everything falls apart. On July 25th, 1755, agents of the Venetian Inquisition arrived at Casanova's door. They came at dawn because that's when you catch people off guard. No explanation, no warning, just a polite insistence that he accompany them immediately. He didn't resist. Resistance would have been pointless, and Casanova was always practical about these things. Besides, he still believed Bragadin's influence would protect him. He was about to discover how wrong he was. They took him to the Doge's palace and led him upward, higher and higher, until they reached the attic. The Piombi, the leads, named for the lead plates covering the roof. These cells were Venice's most infamous prison. Not the deepest dungeon or the darkest hole, but something worse. In summer, the lead roof turned the cells into ovens. In winter, they became freezers. The ceiling was so low you couldn't stand upright. The cell was barely 7 feet by 7 feet. No window, just a small grate that let in light, but no air. This is where they put dangerous thinkers, people whose ideas threatened the Republic. Casanova was 30 years old, and his crime, according to the tribunal, was public outrages against the holy religion. What did that mean exactly? They never fully explained. He'd been associating with freethinkers, claiming magical knowledge, possessing forbidden books. He'd been too loud, too visible, too careless about hiding his skepticism toward religious orthodoxy. Venice tolerated many things, but open disrespect for the church crossed a line even Bragadin couldn't erase. The sentence was 5 years. 5 years in a cell where you couldn't stand up. 5 years in heat that made you feel like your brain was melting. 5 years with nothing to do but think about how you'd thrown away every advantage you'd been given. Most prisoners broke within months. Some went mad. Casanova did neither. Instead, he decided to escape, not eventually, not when circumstances improved, immediately. The Piombi was supposedly escape-proof. Nobody had ever gotten out. The cells were at the top of the palace, surrounded by guards with lead sheets making tunnelling impossible. But Casanova had one advantage over previous prisoners. He was smarter than the people who designed the security. During his daily exercise period, a brief walk through the palace attic, he found a piece of iron bar. Weeks, he sharpened it against the marble. Weeks, he sharpened it against the marble floor, working slowly and quietly, turning it into a spike sharp enough to dig through wood. The plan was simple. Dig through the floor beneath his bed, drop down into the room below, which was the Inquisitor's own chamber, break through their ceiling during the night, when the palace was empty, and escape through the main entrance. It was audacious to the point of insanity. If he was caught in the attempt, his sentence would become life imprisonment or worse, but staying meant 5 years of slow degradation, and Casanova couldn't accept that. He dug for months, every night pulling up the floorboards, scraping away at the wood and plaster, making a hole large enough to squeeze through. The work was exhausting in the heat. The noise was a constant risk, but he persisted, driven by the same stubborn refusal to accept limitations that had defined his entire life. Then, just as he was about to break through, disaster struck. His patron Bragadin, still working connections on the outside, managed to convince the authorities to move Casanova to a better cell, slightly larger, slightly more comfortable. The guards came to relocate him, and Casanova had to watch helplessly as months of work disappeared. The new cell offered no opportunity for the same plan. He was back to square one, except now the guards were watching him more carefully. Most people would have given up. Casanova got angry. Anger is useful if you channel it correctly, and he channeled his into planning something even more impossible. There was a monk in the next cell, Father Marino Balbi. Casanova could hear him through the walls. They developed a system of communication, tapping in code, eventually managing to pass notes through a sympathetic guard who could be bribed. Casanova convinced Balbi to help with a new escape plan. This one was wilder. They'd break through the roof itself, climb across the lead plates, break into the main palace through a window, and walk out the front door in the morning when the palace opened. It required tools, coordination, and nerves of steel. Balbi wasn't the ideal partner, frankly. The monk was cowardly and prone to panic, but he was what Casanova had to work with. Casanova managed to acquire a better tool, a metal spike hidden in a Bible that a contact smuggled in. He passed it to Balbi. Through the book exchange system, prisoners were allowed. Balbi, despite his fears, managed to dig through the ceiling of his cell. On the night of October 31st, 1756, All Saints' Eve, they made their move. Balbi broke into Casanova's cell from above, having crawled through the attic space. Together, they climbed up into the roof space, a maze of beams and lead plates, pitch dark and terrifyingly high above the stone floors below. One wrong step meant a fatal fall. They crawled for what felt like hours, navigating by touch, until they found a window leading into the palace proper. Breaking through took time. The window was small, the frame old but sturdy. They finally smashed through and dropped down into a room in the palace. Dishevelled and covered in dust, but inside the building. Now came the truly insane part. They couldn't sneak out. The palace was locked at night. Guards everywhere, no way to slip through unnoticed. So Casanova decided they'd walk out in plain sight. He and Balbi brushed themselves off as best they could, trying to look less like escaping prisoners and more like lost nobles who'd gotten turned around in the massive building. At dawn, when the palace opened and officials began arriving for work, they simply walked down the main staircase and out the front door. Guards saw them. Palace officials saw them. Nobody stopped them because nobody could quite believe that two men walking confidently through the Doge's palace at dawn could possibly be escaped prisoners. The audacity created its own disguise. They walked across the square, found a gondola, and told the gondolier to take them to the mainland. By the time anyone realised what had happened, Casanova was gone. This escape became legendary. It was the only successful escape from the Piombi in history. Casanova later wrote about it in detail, and the account reads like an adventure novel, because that's essentially what it was. But at the time, he wasn't thinking about posterity. He was thinking about survival. Venice would hunt him. They couldn't let such an embarrassment go unpunished. He needed to get far away, fast, and he needed money and connections when he got there. He fled to Paris. France was the natural destination, because he already had contacts there from his previous travels. Paris in 1756 was the intellectual and cultural capital of Europe, the city where ideas mattered, and where a clever man with the right connections could reinvent himself. Casanova arrived with nothing except his reputation and his wits. He needed both. His escape story preceded him, spreading through social networks, escaped from the inescapable prison. It was the kind of credential that opened doors, proof of resourcefulness and daring that aristocrats found thrilling. He leveraged it immediately, securing introductions to influential figures. One introduction led to another, and soon he was meeting with Madame de Pompadour, the king's mistress, and one of the most powerful people in France. This is where things get interesting because Casanova did something unexpected. Instead of continuing as a charming adventurer living on his wits, he proposed a business venture, a lottery. France's military academy, the École Militaire, needed funding. The government wanted to raise money without imposing new taxes, which were always unpopular. Lotteries were becoming fashionable across Europe as a revenue source, but France didn't have a national system yet. Casanova saw the opportunity. He'd studied mathematics. He understood probability better than most people at court. He proposed a specific lottery structure that would generate massive revenue while appearing to offer reasonable odds to players. The genius was in the design. Players chose 5 numbers from 1 to 90. The combinations seemed manageable to the average person, who didn't understand just how astronomical the odds actually were. But Casanova did. He could calculate the probability of any given combination winning, and he knew the house advantage was enormous. He presented the plan to the council, overseeing the École Militaire, with Pompadour's backing, would believe the game was fair, that even the king would not be able to influence the outcome, would believe the game was fair, that even the king could lose, making them more willing to participate. The council approved it. The Loterie de l'École Militaire was established by decree in October 1757. The first drawing happened in April 1758. It was a sensation. People from every social class bought tickets. The nobility gambled for entertainment. The middle class gambled for hope. Even servants spent their wages on tickets. The revenue was staggering. 600,000 livres from the first drawing alone, with 400,000 coming from Paris. Casanova had structured the deal, so he received a percentage. Not the largest cut, but enough to make him wealthy. Within a year, he'd gone from escaped prisoner to millionaire. By 18th century standards, that's exactly what he became. His fortune was estimated in the hundreds of thousands of livres. He bought property, fine clothes, carriages. He gambled at the best tables, attended the opera, hosted dinners. For the first time in his life, he wasn't scrambling for the next opportunity. He had security, status, and time to enjoy both. But Casanova being Casanova, he couldn't just be wealthy. He had to keep pushing boundaries, keep seeking new experiences. He became involved with a secret society, not the Freemasons this time, but something more exclusive, the aristocracy's inner circles where the real power resided. He met philosophers, scientists, artists. He had conversations with Voltaire, though they didn't particularly like each other. Too many similarities, perhaps. Both brilliant self-promoters who'd risen above their birth circumstances through sheer force of personality. During these Paris years, Casanova was at his peak. Wealthy, connected, admired. He moved through society with confidence earned through years of experience. He knew how to read a room, how to make himself indispensable, how to be entertaining without being threatening. He helped people with problems, made introductions, facilitated deals. He became a fixer, the person you went to when you needed something done quietly. And of course, there were women. Dozens of affairs during this period, each one documented in his memoirs, with varying degrees of detail. Some were quick encounters, others lasted months. He fell in love repeatedly, or what passed for love in his emotional vocabulary. The pattern was always similar: intense attraction, pursuit, conquest, and then either he left or she did. He seemed incapable of sustaining long-term relationships, possibly because he'd never seen a functional one growing up. His mother had abandoned him. His father, whoever that actually was, had been absent. Every woman eventually left or was left. That became the template he repeated endlessly. What's fascinating about this period is watching Casanova navigate genuine success. Most of his life had been defined by instability, by needing to stay one step ahead of disaster. Now he had stability, and it should have been satisfying. But satisfaction wasn't in his nature. He kept gambling, kept taking risks, kept pursuing new schemes even though he didn't need the money. The compulsion wasn't about wealth. It was about the game itself, about proving he could still do it, still seduce, still win, still outsmart everyone. This psychology explains what happened next, because despite everything, despite the money and the position and the possibilities, Casanova managed to throw it all away. Paris wouldn't last, nothing ever did. The collapse began with a woman, naturally. Her name was Madame d'Urfé. She was 60 years old, wealthy beyond measure, and completely insane. Not clinically insane, but close enough. She believed in magic, in alchemy, in the possibility of transmigration of souls. She'd spent decades searching for someone who could help her achieve immortality by transferring her soul into the body of a newborn male child. When she met Casanova, she decided he was that someone. Casanova recognized the opportunity immediately. Here was a woman with unlimited money and unlimited credulity. She wanted to believe in magic, needed to believe in it, and he could give her that belief. For a price, he became her spiritual advisor, her guide through the mystical realms she desperately wanted to access. He performed elaborate rituals, consulted with spirits, provided astrological charts, all complete nonsense, but performed with such conviction that she never doubted him. She paid him enormous sums for his services, gave him jewellery, funded his travels. The relationship lasted years, this elaborate con built on her delusions and his willingness to exploit them. This was Casanova at his worst. Not seducing women who could consent, not gambling with people who understood the risks, but manipulating a mentally fragile elderly woman for profit. He justified it to himself by claiming she wanted to be deceived, that he was providing her comfort through her fantasies. But that's the rationalization of every con artist. The truth was simpler and uglier. He needed money, and she had it. The scheme eventually collapsed when he pushed too far. He convinced her that the soul transmigration ritual required her to give birth to a child, which would then receive her soul. She was 60. The logistics were problematic. Casanova's solution involved surrogates, complicated rituals, and promises that grew increasingly absurd. She began having doubts. Her family, watching this obvious exploitation, intervened. Casanova had to flee, leaving behind his comfortable arrangement and the woman he'd been milking for years. Paris was becoming dangerous in other ways too. His gambling debts were mounting again. Despite the lottery fortune, despite Madame d'Urfey's payments, he'd managed to spend it all. The pattern was always the same. Money came in, money went out. Faster, he couldn't help himself. The thrill wasn't in having wealth, it was in risking it, spending it, using it to create experiences and opportunities. By 1760, his creditors were closing in. The authorities were asking questions about some of his business dealings. He'd made enemies among people who had power and weren't afraid to use it. One night, sensing the net tightening, Casanova made a decision that had become almost routine by now. He left. Quickly, quietly, leaving debts and obligations behind. Paris had given him 5 years of success and luxury. Now it was over. He headed south through France, stopping in Lyon, then crossing into Switzerland. In Geneva, he met Voltaire, the most famous intellectual in Europe. The meeting was not a success. 2 egos that size couldn't occupy the same room comfortably. Voltaire was dismissive, Casanova defensive. They argued about religion, philosophy, theatre. Both men were brilliant conversationalists who'd built their reputations partly on their wit. Neither wanted to concede ground to the other. Casanova left Geneva unimpressed with Voltaire's courtesy and certain that Voltaire was equally unimpressed with him. From Switzerland, he travelled to southern Germany, then to Florence, Italy again, but not Venice. He couldn't return to Venice. That door remained closed. Florence provided temporary shelter, but not opportunity. He was running low on funds, low on contacts, low on options. The network he'd built in Paris didn't extend here. He was starting over again, but older now, less resilient. In Rome, he tried various schemes. He offered his services as a financial consultant, as a diplomatic intermediary, as anything that might generate income. Some schemes worked temporarily, others failed immediately. He was gambling constantly, winning and losing, but mostly losing. The luck that had carried him through earlier crises seemed to be deserting him. Then London. He arrived in 1763, age 38, hoping England's capital would offer opportunities Paris had denied him. London was massive, wealthy, commercially dynamic. It should have been perfect for Casanova's talents. Instead, it became a disaster. The English didn't respond to him the way the French had. His continental charm fell flat. The social rules were different and more rigid. The aristocracy was harder to penetrate. And London was expensive. Everything cost more than he'd anticipated. His lodgings, his clothes, his entertainment. The gambling was fierce and professional. These weren't French nobles playing for amusement. These were serious gamblers who knew every trick he knew, and several he didn't. He fell into debt immediately and deeply. English creditors were less forgiving than French ones. They had him arrested for unpaid debts. Debtor's prison in 18th century London was not somewhere you wanted to be. Casanova spent months there, surrounded by men who'd lost everything, watching days turn into weeks while his situation grew more desperate. Eventually, friends secured his release by paying enough of his debts to satisfy the most aggressive creditors. But the experience marked him. He'd been humiliated, imprisoned, reduced to begging for help. His confidence, that essential tool he'd relied on throughout his life, was shaken. London had beaten him in ways Venice's prison never had. He left England broken, travelling back to the continent with borrowed money. He was nearly 40 years old, homeless, without prospects, carrying nothing but debts and damaged reputation. The arc of his life, which had seemed to trend perpetually upward despite setbacks, had definitively turned downward. The next decade became a blur of movement: Germany, Austria, Poland, Russia. He travelled constantly, never staying anywhere long enough to establish himself. He took whatever work he could find. He wrote pamphlets, gave music lessons, dealt cards in gambling houses, served as a secretary, worked as a spy. Nothing lasted. Every opportunity turned sour, every scheme collapsed. In Berlin, he met Frederick the Great, who offered him a position. Casanova considered it, then decided the salary wasn't enough and the work beneath him. This decision, rejecting stable employment from one of Europe's most powerful monarchs, perfectly illustrates how his pride sabotaged him. He couldn't accept that his circumstances had changed, that he was no longer the celebrated figure who could pick and choose opportunities. He was a middle-aged man with no money and no prospects, but he acted like he still had options. He went to St. Petersburg instead, hoping to find opportunities in Catherine the Great's court. Russia was expanding, modernizing, seeking Western expertise. Casanova presented himself as that expertise. He proposed various schemes: a lottery modelled on his Paris success, financial reforms, educational initiatives. Catherine listened politely and declined. She could see what he was: a clever man past his prime, desperate for one more score. Warsaw offered temporary employment. He became involved in Polish politics during a particularly chaotic period. Multiple factions were fighting for control, foreign powers were interfering, and Casanova tried to position himself as a useful intermediary. He failed. Polish politics were too complicated, too violent, too unpredictable, even for someone with his skills. He left Poland with nothing to show for his time there, except more stories and more debts. Throughout these years of wandering, he kept writing letters, pamphlets, treatises on various subjects. He wrote about mathematics, about politics, about philosophy. Most of it went unpublished or was published to indifference. Nobody wanted to read Casanova's thoughts on governance or economics. His celebrity, such as it was, rested on his reputation as an adventurer and seducer, not as a serious thinker. But he couldn't accept that. He believed he had important things to say, insights worth sharing. The world disagreed. The women continued, of course. Even in decline, even broke, he kept seducing. It was the one skill that never completely deserted him. In every city he found someone: an innkeeper's daughter, a minor noblewoman, an actress. The encounters were briefer now, less romantic. He was older, less attractive, more desperate. The charm was wearing thin. Women still responded to him, but not the way they had when he was younger. The power dynamic had shifted. He needed them more than they needed him. By 1774, Casanova was 49 years old and had been away from Venice for 18 years. He'd travelled across Europe multiple times, held dozens of different positions, lived in countless cities. He'd been wealthy and poor, celebrated and forgotten, imprisoned and freed. And now he was tired. The constant movement, the perpetual search for the next opportunity, the endless need to reinvent himself. It was exhausting. Venice had changed in his absence. The city's decline had accelerated. What had been a major power when he left was now a fading shadow. The aristocracy was weaker, the economy struggling, the political situation precarious. But it was still Venice, still home, and Casanova wanted to go home. He began petitioning for permission to return. He wrote letters to his old patron Bragadin, to other influential figures who remembered him. He promised to behave, to avoid scandal, to be a model citizen. The process took months. The Venetian authorities were suspicious. They remembered why they'd imprisoned him, remembered the charges of sacrilege and immorality. Why should they let him return? Finally, in September 1774, permission was granted. Not a full pardon, but conditional approval. He could return to Venice, but under certain restrictions. He agreed to everything. He would have agreed to anything. At 49, after nearly 2 decades of exile, Giacomo Casanova was going home. What he didn't know yet was that his return would prove almost as complicated as his exile had been. Venice greeted him like a ghost, returning to haunt familiar streets. The city remembered him, but not fondly, not the way he'd hoped. His return in September 1774 created a stir. People whispered. Some were curious, others hostile. The man who'd escaped from the Leads had become legend in his absence, but legends make uncomfortable neighbours. The authorities watched him carefully. They'd granted permission for his return, with conditions attached, restrictions that became clear immediately. He couldn't just resume his old life. The Venice he'd left 18 years ago had moved on without him. His patron Bragadin was much older now, still supportive, but less influential. The social circles that had once embraced him were wary. Too much scandal, too much history. And Casanova himself had changed. He was 49, past the age where charm alone could open every door. The first months back were strange. He tried to re-establish himself, reconnect with old contacts, find his place again. But Venice in 1774 wasn't the Venice of 1756. The city's decline had accelerated. What had been a major European power was now a fading anachronism, clinging to past glory while newer, stronger nations reshaped the continent around it. The economy was weaker. The aristocracy had less wealth to throw around. The atmosphere felt different, more conservative, more cautious. The freewheeling spirit that had defined Venice during Casanova's youth was giving way to something more anxious and defensive, a dying empire protecting what little remained. Casanova needed work. He needed income. The authorities had made clear he was back on probation, and that meant he couldn't afford controversy. He had to prove himself useful, demonstrate that his return wouldn't cause problems. So he became a spy. The Venetian inquisitors of state offered him a position as a confidential informant. It wasn't prestigious work. It was the opposite of prestigious, but it paid, and it gave him a role, a function, a reason to be tolerated. His job was to report on other people. He attended social gatherings, listened to conversations, noted who said what about whom. He identified potential troublemakers, people expressing dangerous opinions, foreigners who might be working against Venetian interests. Then he wrote reports and submitted them to his handlers. It was degrading work for someone who'd once been a celebrity. But what choice did he have? He needed the money, needed the protection, and maybe part of him found it grimly appropriate. The man who'd spent his life manipulating others was now being manipulated himself, reduced to informing on acquaintances and strangers for a stipend. The reports he filed reveal a lot about this period. They're detailed, observant, sometimes petty. He wrote about theatre performances, about what people said at parties, about who was sleeping with whom. He passed along gossip, rumours, speculation. Most of it was probably useless to the authorities, but he kept filing reports anyway, justifying his salary. Did he feel guilty about this? The memoirs don't say. He barely mentions his work as an informant, which suggests shame, or at least awareness, that it wasn't his finest moment. But he did it for 8 years, from 1774 to 1782, so he clearly needed the income badly enough to overcome whatever moral qualms he might have had. During these years, he tried to maintain his old lifestyle on a fraction of his former resources. He still gambled, though he couldn't afford to lose. He still pursued women, though his reputation made seduction harder. He still tried to present himself as a gentleman of means, despite everyone knowing he was broke and working for the secret police. He wrote, constantly, essays, poems, translations, treatises on various subjects. He translated the Iliad into Italian, a massive project that took years and earned him almost nothing. He wrote mathematical papers that nobody read. He composed plays that theatres wouldn't produce. The writing was his attempt to establish himself as a serious intellectual, to prove he was more than just an adventurer and seducer, but the public wasn't interested in Casanova the scholar. They wanted Casanova, the scandalous libertine, and that wasn't a role he could profit from anymore. His translation of the Iliad is actually impressive by accounts of people who've read it. He captured something of Homer's energy while adapting it for Italian audiences. But impressive doesn't mean profitable. The project consumed vast amounts of his time and energy for minimal financial return. It was a labour of love, or pride, or desperation, maybe all three. He also got involved in various business schemes, printing ventures, real estate deals, import-export operations. All of them failed. Casanova had never been good with money, never developed the patience or discipline that successful business requires. He was always looking for the big score, the clever trick that would solve all his problems at once. That approach had worked occasionally in his youth, but it stopped working as he aged. The women continued, though the dynamics had shifted completely. He was older, less attractive, broke. The women who responded to him now were different from the noble women and actresses of his prime. They were often women in difficult circumstances themselves, women who needed something from him, even as he needed something from them. One relationship from this period stands out. A woman named Francesca Buschini, an actress, became his lover, and something close to a companion. The relationship was more practical than romantic. They helped each other survive. She needed connections and protection. He needed companionship and the illusion of his younger self. It wasn't grand passion, but it was something, a mutual arrangement that worked for both of them. But Casanova couldn't stay out of trouble. In 1779, he published a satirical pamphlet attacking the Venetian nobility. Specifically, he went after a nobleman named Carlo Grimani, writing a vicious satire that mocked Grimani's pretensions and incompetence. Why did he do this? Probably multiple reasons. He was frustrated with his situation, bitter about his treatment, angry at the aristocracy that had once embraced him and now barely tolerated him. The satire was his way of hitting back, of asserting some kind of power in a situation where he'd become powerless. It was also incredibly stupid. He was living in Venice on sufferance, working as an informant for the very authorities he was now provoking. The satire was published anonymously, but everyone knew who'd written it. Casanova's style was too distinctive, his grievances too obvious. The response was swift. The Grimani family was powerful, and they demanded action. The inquisitors who'd been paying Casanova couldn't protect him from this. He'd crossed a line, attacked someone too important to ignore. In 1783, Casanova was expelled from Venice again. Not arrested this time, just expelled, told to leave and not come back. After 9 years of trying to rebuild his life in his hometown, he was exiled once more. At 58 years old, he had to start over again in foreign cities. This second exile was worse than the first. Last time, he'd been young, energetic, full of confidence that he could succeed anywhere. This time, he was old, tired, running out of options. Europe was running out of places that would welcome him. He wandered again. Vienna, then various German cities, then Bohemia. He was looking for work, for patronage, for anyone who'd hire him. The jobs he found were increasingly menial. He wasn't a celebrity anymore, wasn't even particularly useful. He was just an aging Italian with a scandalous past, trying to survive. Then in 1785, something unexpected happened. Count Joseph Karl von Waldstein, a Bohemian nobleman, offered him a position. Not a prestigious position, but a position nonetheless. Librarian at Waldstein's castle in Dux, a small town in northern Bohemia. Casanova was 60 years old. He'd spent 40 years travelling across Europe, living in grand cities, mixing with the most famous people of his era. And now he was being offered a job as a librarian in a provincial castle in Bohemia. He accepted. What else could he do? The alternative was continuing to wander, continuing to search for opportunities that weren't coming. At least this was stable. A salary, room and board, a place to live. After decades of instability, that mattered more than prestige. So in 1785, Giacomo Casanova moved to Dux Castle. It was supposed to be temporary, just until something better came along. But nothing better came along. Dux became his final home, the place where he'd spend the last 13 years of his life. The castle itself was impressive, a sprawling complex with extensive grounds. But impressive doesn't mean lively. Dux was isolated, far from major cities, far from the cultural centres where Casanova had spent his life. The nearest town was small, provincial, offering nothing that interested him. His job as librarian was real but not demanding. He organised the Count's book collection, maintained the catalogue, occasionally helped with research. It was work that required education and attention to detail, but it wasn't intellectually stimulating. Mostly it was boring. Count Waldstein was often absent, travelling or attending to business elsewhere. When he was at the castle, he treated Casanova politely but distantly. Not a friend, not really an employer either. Something in between. Waldstein had hired Casanova partly out of charity, partly because having a famous author as his librarian added a certain cachet, but he didn't particularly want to spend time with him. They mocked him, played tricks on him, made his daily existence unpleasant in petty ways. Casanova, who dined with kings and charmed the most sophisticated women in Europe, was now being tormented by provincial servants who saw him as a pretentious foreigner. He complained constantly in letters to friends. The food was bad. The company was worse. He was lonely, bored, trapped. He considered leaving, but had nowhere to go. This was it. This was where his adventures had led him. A castle in Bohemia, surrounded by people who didn't like him, doing work that didn't challenge him, waiting to die. But something else was happening during these years at Dux, something that would prove far more important than anything else Casanova had ever done. He was writing his memoirs. The idea had been forming for years. He'd always known his life was extraordinary, worth recording, but he'd never had the time or stability to undertake such a massive project. Now, trapped in Dux with nothing else to do, he finally had both. In 1789, he began writing. Not for publication, at least not immediately. He was writing for himself, to preserve his memories, to make sense of his life, to prove, perhaps, that it had all meant something. He wrote in French, the language of educated Europe, not his native Italian. This was a deliberate choice. French gave him distance, allowed him to shape his story with more control. It also ensured his work would reach the widest possible audience, if it ever was published. The writing consumed him. He worked 13 hours a day, filling page after page with his recollections. The memories came back vividly, sometimes too vividly. He was reliving his youth, his adventures, his loves, everything he'd lost. The manuscript grew at an astonishing pace. By the time he was finished, he'd written 12 volumes covering his life from birth through 1774. That's where it ended. Not because his life ended there, but because that was when he'd left Venice for the second time, heading toward the exile that would eventually land him at Dux. The years after 1774 weren't worth recording. They would just decline. The good parts of his life had already happened. The complete work ran to about 3,700 pages, nearly 4,000 pages of memories, adventures, seductions, escapes, written in meticulous detail with dates and places and names. He remembered everything, or at least claimed to. Some of it was certainly embellished. He was writing entertainment, not a legal deposition, but the core was true and he knew it. He called it Histoire de ma vie, the story of my life. Simple title for an extraordinary document. As he wrote, he shared portions with a few trusted visitors to Dux. One was Prince Charles Joseph de Ligne, a Belgian nobleman and military officer who'd become one of Casanova's few genuine friends in his final years. De Ligne was fascinated by the manuscript, encouraging Casanova to continue. He understood what he was reading. This wasn't just one man's autobiography. It was a portrait of an entire era, a window into 18th century Europe that no historian could match. Because Casanova had been everywhere. He'd moved through every level of society, from gambling dens to royal courts. He'd known the famous and the forgotten. He'd witnessed major historical events and countless minor ones. And he remembered them all with the eye of someone who'd always been watching, always taking notes mentally, always preparing to tell the story later. The sexual content was explicit, far more so than anything published in his lifetime. He described his affairs in frank detail, holding nothing back. This wasn't pornography, though. It was honest. He was writing about the reality of his life, not creating fantasy. And that reality included a great deal of sex. To censor it would have been to lie about who he was and what he'd done. But the memoirs were about more than seduction. They contained his observations on politics, religion, philosophy, science, his encounters with Voltaire, Rousseau, Frederick the Great, his thoughts on everything from theatre to mathematics. The book was a comprehensive record of his mind, not just his bedroom adventures. Modern readers who come to the memoirs expecting nothing but erotica are often surprised by how much else is there. He worked on the manuscript until he couldn't anymore. Even as his health failed, he kept writing, revising, polishing. It became his reason for living, the one thing that justified continuing when everything else had been taken from him. In 1797, Prince de Ligne visited Dux one last time. He found Casanova in bad shape, failing physically, increasingly withdrawn, but still writing, always writing. De Ligne urged him to prepare the manuscript for publication, but Casanova hesitated. He wasn't sure he wanted the world to read it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. It was too personal, too revealing, and he was still alive. Publishing it meant confronting the judgment of a world that had already forgotten him. He never made the decision. On June 4th, 1798, Giacomo Casanova died at Dux Castle. He was 73 years old. His last words, according to witnesses, were, "I have lived as a philosopher and I die as a Christian." A neat summary, though it's hard to know if he actually said it or if someone invented the quote later. It sounds like something he would have wanted to say. He was buried in the church cemetery at Dux. A simple grave, nothing elaborate, no monument marking the resting place of the man who'd lived the most remarkable life of his century. The location of his grave was eventually lost. Today, nobody knows exactly where Casanova is buried. The cemetery was reorganized, records were misplaced or destroyed, and the precise spot disappeared from memory. But the manuscript survived. That's what matters. After Casanova's death, the Histoire de ma vie passed to his nephew, Carlo Angiolini. Carlo recognized its value, but also its danger. The content was too scandalous for immediate publication. He kept it hidden, showing it only to a few trusted friends. For decades, the manuscript sat in storage, unknown to the world. Then in 1820, a German publisher named Friedrich Arnold Brockhaus somehow acquired the manuscript. Brockhaus recognized what he had. This was explosive material, sure to sell, but publishing it as written was impossible. The content would have caused outrage, possible legal trouble, so Brockhaus commissioned a heavily censored German translation. The translator, Wilhelm von Schütz, cut entire sections, toned down the sexual content, removed anything too controversial. This butchered version appeared in 12 volumes between 1822 and 1828 as Aus den Memoiren des Venetianers Jacob Casanova de Seingalt. It was successful, selling well across Europe. Readers were fascinated by this glimpse into the 18th century, even in sanitized form. But it wasn't really Casanova's book. It was a pale shadow of what he'd written. French publishers wanted their own edition. Jean Laforgue produced a French translation in 1826, but he was working from the censored German version, not the original manuscript. He added his own cuts and changes. By this point, the text had been filtered through multiple hands, each removing or altering what they found objectionable. The result bore only a distant resemblance to Casanova's actual words. This pattern continued for over a century. Every edition, published before 1960, was based on these corrupted early translations. Scholars and readers assumed they were reading Casanova's authentic memoirs, but they were actually reading heavily edited versions that removed much of what made the book remarkable. The explicit sexual content was gone. The philosophical reflections were trimmed. The raw honesty was softened into something more palatable. Meanwhile, the original manuscript remained in the possession of Brockhaus's descendants. They kept it locked away, refusing to allow scholars access. They'd built a publishing business, partly on their censored version of Casanova, and they had no interest in undermining that with the real thing. The manuscript became legendary among scholars. Everyone knew it existed, but nobody could see it. Then in 1960, Brockhaus finally agreed to publish the complete, uncensored text. It took 2 years to produce all 12 volumes. When the final volume appeared in 1962, scholars finally had access to what Casanova had actually written. The difference was stunning. This wasn't just a matter of restored sexual content. The original manuscript was richer, more detailed, more thoughtful than anyone had realized. Casanova's voice came through clearly for the first time. His wit, his intelligence, his complicated relationship with the life he'd lived. The book revealed someone far more interesting than the simple seducer of popular imagination. Yes, he'd slept with many women. He wrote about it frankly, but he also wrote about his intellectual pursuits, his scientific interests, his philosophical struggles. He reflected on aging, on loss, on the meaning of his experiences. He questioned himself, admitted mistakes, he showed vulnerability. This was a complete human being, not a cartoon libertine. Modern scholars consider the Histoire de ma vie one of the most important documents of the 18th century. It provides first-hand accounts of major historical figures and events. It offers insights into daily life across Europe that no other source can match. And it does all this while telling a genuinely compelling story. Casanova was a natural writer, structuring his narrative for maximum impact, creating scenes that feel novelistic in their vividness. But here's what's strange. Despite finally having access to the complete, authentic text, the popular image of Casanova hasn't really changed. Most people still know him only as a seducer, a playboy, someone whose name has become synonymous with womanizing. They don't know about his escape from prison, his invention of the lottery, his philosophical writings, his conversations with Voltaire. They certainly haven't read his memoirs. The manuscript itself has had its own adventures since publication. In 2010, the French National Library purchased the original handwritten pages from Brockhaus for €7 million. It's now preserved in Paris, available to scholars who want to study Casanova's actual handwriting, his revisions, his corrections. The physical manuscript reveals how carefully he worked, how seriously he took the project. This wasn't hastily scribbled reminiscence, it was literature, crafted with attention to style and structure. And there are still secrets in those pages. Some sections remain unpublished even today. A few passages were too damaged to read. Others contain material the French library has chosen not to release, though scholars debate what could possibly be left that's more scandalous than what's already public. 4 complete chapters are missing, lost at some point between Casanova's death and the manuscript's eventual publication. Nobody knows what they contained. Casanova's life had so many adventures that losing a few chapters means losing stories will never recover. The memoirs end abruptly in 1774. Casanova never explained why he stopped there. He lived another 24 years after that date, but he chose not to record them. Perhaps because nothing interesting happened. Perhaps because those years were too painful to revisit. He'd spent them in gradual decline, watching himself become irrelevant, ending up at ducks. Why write about that? Better to end the story while there were still victories to celebrate, adventures to recount, women to remember. But that decision means we're missing the final act. We don't get Casanova's own account of his last decades. We don't know what he thought about growing old, about being forgotten, about spending his final years in a Bohemian castle. We have to infer it from the fact that he wrote the memoirs at all, that he needed to prove his life had mattered. The writing itself was the statement. I existed. I did these things. I was remarkable. Don't forget me. Of course, people did forget him. For most of the 19th century, Casanova was a minor figure, known mainly from the censored versions of his memoirs. He wasn't taught in universities, wasn't considered important to history, just an amusing character from the past, a rogue with good stories. The 20th century started to reassess that judgment. Scholars began recognizing the memoir's historical value. Biographers attempted to separate fact from embellishment, to understand the real man behind the legend. What they found was complicated. Casanova was brilliant but erratic, charming but manipulative, capable of genuine affection but also of casual cruelty. He lived entirely for himself, pursuing pleasure without much concern for consequences. Yet he also showed flashes of generosity, loyalty, even wisdom. He defies easy categorization. He was too contradictory, too multifaceted. That's partly why his book remains fascinating. He presents himself honestly, including the unflattering parts. You finish the memoirs liking him and being frustrated by him simultaneously. The writing at ducks consumed Casanova's final years. It gave him purpose when he had nothing else. It allowed him to escape his present by reliving his past, and it created something that outlasted him, that kept his memory alive long after everyone who knew him was dead. The man may have died forgotten in a Bohemian castle, but the book ensured he wouldn't stay forgotten. He made corrections, crossed out words, added phrases in the margins. The physical manuscript is a record of the writing process itself, of an old man in a foreign castle, pouring his memories onto paper, racing against time and death. He didn't finish the story. Not really. The memoirs break off and we're left wondering what else he might have written if he'd lived longer, if he'd had more time. But what he did write was enough. 12 volumes covering 50 years of the most extraordinary life of his era. That's his legacy. Not the seductions, not the scandals, not the myth, the book. The actual words he wrote, finally available in their uncensored form. That's what Casanova left behind. The man may have died forgotten in a Bohemian castle, but the book ensured he wouldn't stay forgotten. That book sits now in the French National Library, its pages yellowed and fragile. Casanova's handwriting fills them, sometimes neat, sometimes hurried, always distinctive. You can see where he made corrections, crossed out words, added phrases in the margins. The physical manuscript is a record of the writing process itself, of an old man in a foreign castle, pouring his memories onto paper, racing against time and death. He didn't finish the story. Not really. The memoirs break off, and we're left wondering what else he might have written if he'd lived longer, if he'd had more time. But what he did write was enough. 12 volumes covering 50 years of the most extraordinary life of his era. That's his legacy. Not the seductions, not the scandals, not the myth. The book, the actual words he wrote, finally available in their uncensored form. What happened to those words after Casanova died tells its own story about reputation, censorship, and how history gets rewritten by people who weren't there. This wasn't a tidy inheritance. It was thousands of pages of explicit sexual content, detailed accounts of cons and frauds, criticism of powerful families, stories that could embarrass descendants of people still living. Carlo kept the manuscript for years without publishing it. He knew it was valuable. He also knew it was dangerous. Then in 1820, a German publisher named Friedrich Arnold Brockhaus bought the rights. Brockhaus recognized the historical importance immediately. These weren't just scandalous adventures. They were a detailed portrait of 18th century European society written by someone who'd actually lived it. But Brockhaus also recognized a problem. Nobody would publish the complete text. Not in 1820. The sexual content alone would have been illegal in most European countries. The political commentary would have angered powerful people. The honest portrayals of nobility would have caused scandals. So Brockhaus did what publishers do. He censored it. The first German edition appeared in 1822, and it was butchered. Entire chapters removed. Sexual descriptions deleted or euphemized beyond recognition. Names changed to protect the guilty. Philosophical passages cut because they seemed boring compared to the adventures. What emerged was Casanova as pure entertainment. A rogue's memoir stripped of context, depth, and anything that might make readers uncomfortable. The book sold well. People loved the exotic locations, the daring escapes, the romantic conquests presented in sanitized form. But it wasn't what Casanova wrote. French translations followed, based on the censored German version. More cuts, more changes. By the time an English translation appeared in 1894, done by Arthur Machen, the text had been filtered through multiple layers of Victorian prudishness and editorial intervention. That became the standard version for over a century. When people talked about Casanova's memoirs, they were talking about a text he wouldn't have recognized. The book that made him famous was a shadow of what he'd actually written. The real manuscript sat in Brockhaus's archives, mostly forgotten. Scholars knew it existed. Some had seen portions of it. But nobody had published the complete, uncensored text. Why? Partly because of continued moral concerns. Even in the early 20th century, publishing explicit content was legally risky. Partly because the censored version was working just fine commercially. The manuscript was difficult to read. Casanova's handwriting deteriorated as he aged. He wrote in 18th century French with Italian influences, using spellings and grammar that were already outdated by the time scholars examined the text. But when the complete edition finally appeared between 1960 and 1962, it transformed Casanova's reputation. Suddenly he wasn't just a libertine with good stories, he was a serious historical source, a detailed observer of his era, a writer of considerable skill who'd been systematically misrepresented for 140 years. The uncensored memoirs revealed complexity the sanitized versions had erased. Yes, Casanova was promiscuous, but he also displayed genuine affection for many of his lovers. He formed lasting friendships with women he'd once seduced. He showed concern for their welfare after relationships ended. The complete text showed his intellectual interests. His conversations with Voltaire weren't just name-dropping. They were substantive exchanges about philosophy, science, and religion. His encounters with other Enlightenment figures demonstrated he could hold his own with the leading minds of his age. Most importantly, the uncensored version revealed self-awareness the censored editions had hidden. Casanova knew his flaws. He recognized his own manipulations and rationalizations. He presented himself honestly, including the unflattering moments. That honesty is what makes the memoirs remarkable. Most people writing their life stories emphasize triumphs and minimize failures. Casanova did the opposite. He included the humiliating episodes, the times he was outsmarted, the relationships that ended badly because of his own behavior. Why? Maybe because by the time he was writing, his ego didn't need protection anymore. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was simply recording what happened, trusting that the truth was more interesting than any fabrication. The manuscript's journey continued even after the complete edition appeared. In 2010, the French National Library purchased the original manuscript for €7 million. It's now preserved as a national treasure, available for scholarly research but protected from the kind of wear that would destroy it. Digitization has made portions available online. You can see Casanova's actual handwriting, his corrections, his marginalia. It's oddly intimate. These aren't just historical documents, they're the physical record of an old man remembering his youth, trying to make sense of a life that had taken him everywhere and left him nowhere. 4 lost chapters haunt scholars. They're mentioned in the manuscript, but missing from the surviving text. Were they lost? Destroyed? Hidden deliberately? Nobody knows. Casanova references them, suggesting they contained material even he considered too sensitive for potential publication. What could be too sensitive for a man who wrote explicitly about his sexual encounters, his frauds, his escapes from justice? That question drives speculation. Political secrets, dangerous information about powerful families, philosophical heresies that went beyond what was acceptable even in his private writing. We'll never know. The chapters are gone. But their absence adds to the mystique. Even in the complete, uncensored version, there are still secrets. The memoir's influence extends beyond historical interest. Writers have been mining them for centuries. Arthur Schnitzler's play, Casanova's Homecoming, draws directly from the memoirs. Fellini's film Casanova uses them as source material, though Fellini famously hated his protagonist, portraying him as hollow and mechanical. That's the challenge with Casanova. He's endlessly adaptable. You can read him as a hero or a villain, as a free spirit or a selfish hedonist, as a brilliant observer or a self-deluded narcissist. The memoirs support all these interpretations because Casanova was all of these things at different times. Modern scholarship continues excavating the text. Historians use it to understand 18th century social customs, travel conditions, political systems, sexual mores. It's one of the most detailed accounts we have of daily life in that era, written by someone who experienced it across multiple countries and social classes. Literary scholars analyze the writing itself. Casanova had no formal training as a writer, but he developed a distinctive style. Direct, vivid, surprisingly modern in its psychological insight. He understood how to structure a narrative, how to build tension, when to digress and when to drive forward. The French he wrote in was already becoming archaic by the time he died. He used vocabulary and constructions from earlier in the century, mixed with Venetian Italian influences. This creates a distinctive voice that's part of the memoir's appeal. It sounds like someone from another time because it is someone from another time. Translation remains challenging. The sexual vocabulary alone requires careful handling. 18th century French had elaborate euphemisms and slang terms that don't map cleanly onto English. Translators must choose between accuracy and readability, between preserving period-appropriate language and making the text accessible to modern readers. The debate continues about what the memoirs actually prove about Casanova's life. Some scholars accept them as essentially accurate, cross-referencing claims against other historical records and finding substantial confirmation. Others argue he embellished extensively, that the memoirs are autobiography as wish fulfillment rather than documentary. The truth probably lies between these positions. Casanova undoubtedly exaggerated some adventures and omitted embarrassing failures, but the core of his story checks out. He was where he claimed to be. He met the people he said he met. The major events of his life happened roughly as described. What he captured most accurately was himself. Not the external events, which are always subject to memory's distortions, but his internal experience, how it felt to be Casanova, the constant restlessness, the need for novelty and excitement, the inability to settle, the fear of obscurity and ordinariness. Moments of self-awareness, followed by moments of self-awareness, followed by immediate backsliding into old patterns. Reading the complete memoirs reveals something the censored versions obscured. Casanova wasn't celebrating his lifestyle. By the end, he was questioning it. The writing itself was an attempt to understand what his life had meant, whether the constant pursuit of pleasure had been worth the cost. He doesn't answer that question definitively. The memoirs trail off without resolution, without a neat summation of lessons learned. They simply stop mid-story, leaving us with a man who lived fully but died alone, who experienced everything and possessed nothing, who was famous and forgotten, brilliant and foolish, admirable and contemptible. That ambiguity is deliberate. Casanova understood he couldn't be reduced to a simple judgment. His life resisted easy categorization. The memoirs reflect that resistance, presenting the contradictions without attempting to resolve them. The modern myth of Casanova as pure seducer emerged from those censored 19th century editions. Bowdlerized, stripped of context, reduced to bedroom conquests. This simplified version entered popular consciousness and stuck. Films, novels, plays all drew from the distorted image rather than the complex reality. The word Casanova became shorthand for a certain type of man. Smooth, manipulative, emotionally unavailable. A collector of conquests who moves on without attachment. This caricature bears little resemblance to the actual person revealed in the complete memoirs. The real Casanova formed genuine attachments. He maintained correspondence with former lovers decades after their affairs ended. He worried about their welfare, tried to arrange advantageous marriages for them, sent money when they needed it. His relationships with women were transactional in some ways, certainly, but not purely so. He valued intelligence and wit as much as beauty. Many of his most intense affairs were with women who challenged him intellectually. Consider his relationship with the Venetian nun M.M., likely Marina Morosini. Their affair lasted years and involved elaborate arrangements to meet secretly. But the memoirs reveal it was also an intellectual partnership. They discussed philosophy, religion, literature. She introduced him to libertine ideas that shaped his thinking. The physical relationship was part of a broader connection that engaged his mind as much as his body. Or Henriette, who remains mysterious despite his detailed descriptions. She appears suddenly, disappears just as suddenly, leaves him devastated. He never learned her real name or what became of her, yet she clearly represented something different from his other affairs, an equal who saw through him completely and chose to leave anyway. Her assessment of him, both loving and clear-eyed, haunted him for decades. These weren't conquests. They were relationships with complications and consequences. Casanova's memoirs document the emotional fallout as thoroughly as the initial attractions. He describes jealousy, heartbreak, regret. He admits to failures and rejections. The complete picture is messy and human, nothing like the smooth operator of legend. But the legend serves a purpose. It provides a recognizable archetype, a cultural reference point. He's a real Casanova, communicates something instantly, even if what it communicates is inaccurate. The myth has its own life independent of the historical person. This happens with many historical figures. The real individual gets buried under layers of interpretation and adaptation until the popular image bears little relation to documented fact. Cleopatra, Napoleon, Robin Hood. The stories we tell about them reveal more about our own preoccupations than about their actual lives. What does the Casanova myth reveal about us? Perhaps our ambivalence about desire and freedom. We're simultaneously attracted to and repelled by someone who seems to operate outside conventional restraints. We admire the freedom while condemning the lack of commitment. The figure becomes a projection screen for our own conflicts about pleasure, responsibility, and social obligation. The historical Casanova understood this better than most. He was already performing a version of himself during his lifetime. The elaborate self-fashioning, the calculated presentation, the carefully crafted stories. He knew he was creating a character, a public persona that might outlive him. That's partly why he wrote the memoirs. Not just to record what happened, but to control the narrative, to present his version before others could define him. He failed in that goal during his lifetime. The memoirs weren't published until decades after his death, and then only in corrupted form, but the long game worked. The complete text eventually emerged, allowing readers to encounter something closer to his intended self-portrait. What emerges is more interesting than the legend, a man of genuine intellectual curiosity who wasted much of it on schemes and seductions. Someone capable of real insight who often chose superficial pleasures instead. A person who understood his own patterns but couldn't or wouldn't break them. The late sections of the memoirs show increasing self-awareness. He recognizes the repetitive nature of his adventures, acknowledges the emptiness at their core. But he continues anyway, driven by compulsions he can articulate but not control. This makes him modern in ways his contemporaries weren't. The divided consciousness, the gap between understanding and behavior, feels remarkably contemporary. Psychological analysis of Casanova has become its own scholarly subfield. Freudian readings, attachment theory applications, trauma-informed perspectives. Each framework finds abundant material. The abandonment by his mother, the unstable childhood, the constant movement and inability to settle. Classic patterns of insecure attachment, fear of intimacy masked by serial relationships, flight response triggered by genuine connection. But reducing him to psychological case study misses something essential. He was also genuinely talented, genuinely intelligent, genuinely capable of connection when he chose it. The pathology coexisted with real gifts. Both were true simultaneously. His intellectual contributions deserve more recognition than they've received. The science fiction novel Ikasamran, written in his 60s, imagined technological advances that wouldn't exist for over a century. Flying machines, mechanical vehicles, devices for seeing at great distances. Pure speculation, grounded in scientific principles he'd studied decades earlier. The book is unreadable by modern standards, but the imaginative leaps are remarkable. His mathematical work on probability theory, developed through his gambling experiences, contained legitimate insights. His observations about games of chance and risk calculation influenced later mathematicians. Though he rarely received credit, the French lottery system he designed was mathematically sound and financially successful, generating substantial revenue for the state while remaining fair to players. These achievements get forgotten because they don't fit the seducer narrative. We prefer our historical figures simple and categorizable. Casanova the lover, not Casanova the mathematician. The actual person was both, along with many other things the legend ignores. His final years at Duck's Castle represent the saddest part of his story. Not because he died alone, which many people do, but because he spent those years so completely aware of what he'd lost. The memoirs make clear he understood exactly what kind of life he'd lived and what it had cost him. The writing was both documentation and reckoning. He considered suicide multiple times during those final years. The isolation was profound. The daily humiliations from the castle servants, real and painful. He was an old man dependent on charity, mocked by subordinates, forgotten by the world that had once celebrated him. Only the writing kept him going, the chance to relive his adventures through memory and language, to make sense of it all. Whether he succeeded in making sense of it is debatable. The memoirs don't offer clear conclusions or tidy moral lessons. They simply present a life in all its contradiction and complexity. Perhaps that was the only honest approach available. His life resisted simplification. Any attempt to reduce it to a single meaning would falsify it. The manuscript he completed in those final years was enormous. 12 volumes, 3,700 pages, written in French that was already becoming outdated as he composed it. He knew this. He commented on it in the text itself, noting how language had changed, how the idioms he used naturally would seem archaic to future readers. He was writing for an audience he'd never meet, in a language that would continue evolving after his death, about a world that was already vanishing. The ancien régime, the aristocratic culture he'd navigated so skillfully, was collapsing around him. The French Revolution had destroyed the social order that made his adventures possible. The Europe he described in the memoirs no longer existed by the time he finished describing it. This adds another layer of poignancy to the work. It's not just personal memoir, but historical document, preserving a world on the verge of disappearance. The elaborate social codes, the rigid class distinctions, the assumption that aristocratic privilege was natural and permanent, all of it was about to be swept away. Casanova died on June 4th, 1798, at age 73. His last words, according to witnesses, were, "I have lived as a philosopher and I die as a Christian." The statement captures his lifelong tension between rationalist enlightenment, thinking, and conventional religious belief. He never fully resolved that tension. He held contradictory ideas simultaneously, believing and doubting, philosophical and superstitious. He was buried at Dux, but the exact location of his grave has been lost. The cemetery was reorganized, markers were moved or destroyed, and no one bothered to preserve the burial site of an obscure Italian librarian. This final anonymity seems fitting somehow. The man who spent his life pursuing fame and recognition ended in an unmarked grave. But the memoirs survived. The manuscript passed to his nephew, then through various hands, eventually landing with the publisher Brockhaus. The family held onto it for generations, finally selling it to the National Library of France in 2010 for €7 million. Those 3,700 pages, written in fading ink, containing the complete, unexpurgated account of an extraordinary life. What they reveal is someone more complicated and more human than the legend suggests. Not a hero, not a villain, not a cautionary tale or an inspiration. Just a person who lived intensely, observed carefully, and wrote it all down. The writing was his final gamble, his last attempt to beat the odds, a bet that future readers would care about his story, would find something valuable in his account of a life lived without apology or restraint. That bet paid off. We're still reading, still arguing about what his life means, still trying to understand the man behind the myth. The memoirs ensure he won't be forgotten, even if his grave is lost. The words outlasted the body. The story outlasted the facts. He achieved the immortality he craved, though not in the form he might have expected. His legacy is complex and contested, like the man himself. To some, he represents freedom and authenticity, living according to his own desires despite social pressure. To others, he embodies selfishness and exploitation, taking what he wanted regardless of consequences. Both readings find support in the text, because both were true. Perhaps that's the real lesson of Casanova's life and memoirs. People don't reduce to simple judgments. We contain contradictions. We're capable of both generosity and cruelty, wisdom and foolishness, love and manipulation. Casanova lived those contradictions more openly than most, and he documented them more thoroughly than anyone. The memoirs stand as testament to a life fully lived, with all its triumphs and failures, pleasures and regrets, brilliance and stupidity. They're messy and repetitive and self-serving and honest and heartbreaking and ridiculous, like life itself, like the complicated, infuriating, fascinating person who lived it. The manuscript he produced across those lonely years at Dux wasn't just autobiography. It was an act of defiance against erasure. Every page he filled was proof that he'd existed, that his life had contained something worth preserving. He wrote knowing he'd never see publication, never know if anyone would read his words. The writing itself was the point. That desperation to be remembered drives much of the memoir's honesty. He had nothing left to lose by the time he picked up his pen. No reputation to protect, no social position to maintain, no future opportunities that required careful self-presentation. He was an old man in exile, forgotten by the world that had once celebrated him. So he wrote the truth as he understood it. Not a sanitized version, designed to impress, but the actual messy reality of how he'd lived. This makes the memoirs unusual among autobiographies. Most people writing their life stories shape the narrative to present themselves favourably. They emphasize successes and minimize failures. They explain away bad decisions and take credit for good outcomes. Casanova did some of that, certainly, but he also included the embarrassing moments, the times he was outsmarted, the relationships that ended badly because of his own behaviour. He didn't hide his manipulations or rationalise his cons. Why such honesty? Maybe because he'd stopped caring about judgment, or maybe because he understood that the interesting parts of his story were precisely the morally ambiguous moments. The times when he behaved badly, but brilliantly, when he was simultaneously admirable and contemptible. Sanitizing those moments would drain them of interest. The book he wrote is enormous, unwieldy, sometimes tedious, often brilliant. It meanders, digresses, returns to themes obsessively. Reading it straight through requires stamina and patience, but it rewards that effort with something rare. An unfiltered look at how one person experienced the 18th century, not as historians would later reconstruct it, but as someone actually living through it. His observations about daily life matter more historically than his famous adventures. The way people ate, travelled, dressed, courted, gambled, worshipped, the social codes that governed behaviour, the assumptions everyone shared, the things that went without saying because everyone understood them. These details fill the memoirs, preserved accidentally because Casanova was writing for his own satisfaction, not for future historians. He captured voices too, conversations reproduced in such detail that they feel real, even allowing for memory's inevitable distortions, and Casanova's tendency to make himself sound cleverer in retrospect. The way people talked to each other, the jokes they made, the insults they deployed. Language in action, not preserved in formal documents, but in messy human interaction. The sexual content that scandalized censors actually matters least. Yes, he describes his affairs in frank detail, but once you've read a few of those descriptions, they start to blur together. The pattern repeats: attraction, pursuit, conquest, eventual parting. What varies is the context, the complications, the specific personalities involved. Stripping away those contextual details, as the censored editions did, reduces the affairs to mechanical repetition. The complete text shows how each relationship was different, how circumstances shaped outcomes, how Casanova himself changed across decades of these encounters. What emerges is a portrait of desire as complicated and contextual, not a simple biological drive, but something shaped by social position, economic necessity, emotional need, intellectual connection, and pure circumstance. His relationships with women reveal as much about 18th century gender dynamics, marriage customs, and economic pressures as they do about Casanova personally. The memoirs also document how someone without inherited position could navigate aristocratic society. Casanova was an outsider who learned to pass, to perform the role of gentleman convincingly enough to gain access to circles that should have excluded him. He studied the codes, mastered the signals, understood what was required. His success depended on that performance being flawless, but the performance had costs. Constant vigilance about saying the right thing, wearing the right clothes, displaying the right knowledge. One mistake could expose him as the pretender he was. The anxiety of that precarious position runs through the memoirs, though Casanova rarely names it directly. You sense it in his careful descriptions of how he dressed for important meetings, how he prepared conversation topics in advance, how he studied the people he needed to impress. This makes him modern in ways his contemporaries weren't. The constructed identity, the performance of self, the awareness of being always on stage. These are very contemporary concerns, but Casanova lived them 2.5 centuries ago. His memoirs document the emotional cost of social mobility in a rigid class system. The freedom to rise came with the constant fear of falling. His intellectual interests scattered across too many fields for mastery of any single one. He knew enough mathematics to design a lottery, but wasn't a mathematician. He understood medicine well enough to diagnose and treat, but never became a physician. He could discuss philosophy with the era's leading thinkers, but produced no philosophical system of his own. He was a brilliant amateur in an age that was beginning to demand specialization. This dilettantism frustrated him. You can see it in the memoirs, the awareness that he'd never achieved the kind of lasting accomplishment he admired in others. Voltaire had his plays and philosophy. Rousseau had his political theory. Frederick the Great had his kingdom. Casanova had adventures, exciting while they happened, but leaving nothing permanent behind except stories. The memoirs were his attempt to create something permanent, not just documentation, but literature. He crafted scenes, built suspense, developed characters. He understood narrative structure instinctively, knowing when to speed up and when to slow down, when to digress and when to drive forward. The book reads like a novel in places, which is part of why people question its accuracy. But that literary quality is what makes it readable, what allows it to communicate not just facts but feeling. His French was already old-fashioned when he wrote. He used constructions and vocabulary from earlier in the century, mixed with Italian influences from his native Venetian. This created a distinctive voice that's part of the book's appeal. It sounds like someone from another time because it is someone from another time. Modern French readers find it archaic but readable, distant but accessible. Translation into other languages requires constant decisions about how to preserve that period feel while remaining comprehensible. Too much modernization destroys the historical flavor. Too little makes the text impenetrable. English translations vary wildly in their approaches, from Marchand's Victorian version that adds its own layer of outdated language to recent attempts at contemporary readability. What gets lost in any translation is Casanova's actual prose rhythm, his sentence construction, his specific word choices. Reading him in French is a different experience than reading him in English, and reading the complete, uncensored version is radically different from reading the bowdlerized editions that dominated for a century and a half. And the 4 lost chapters haunt scholars because their absence creates a mystery the memoirs otherwise avoid. Casanova was comprehensive to the point of tedium. He included everything, sometimes too much. So what was in those missing chapters that he or someone else deemed too dangerous to preserve? political secrets, occult rituals, sexual material that went beyond even his usual frankness? We'll never know. The chapters vanished at some point between his death and the manuscript's eventual publication. They might have been deliberately removed, or they might have been lost accidentally. The references to them in the surviving text are frustratingly vague, mentioning topics without detailing contents. This mystery adds to the memoir's mystique, suggesting depths we can't access, secrets withheld. But it's also frustrating because it means the account we have is incomplete. Whatever was in those chapters, Casanova thought it was important enough to write, and then to reference in the remaining text. Their absence is a gap in our understanding of both the man and his era. The manuscript's physical condition reflects its journey through time. The pages show water damage, stains, evidence of rough handling. Casanova's handwriting deteriorates across the volumes as he aged and his health failed. The early pages are neat and controlled. The later ones sometimes trail off, words becoming illegible, corrections multiplying. You can see him struggling to maintain clarity as his body betrayed him. Those physical details matter because they're evidence of the writing process, proof that this wasn't a carefully planned literary work, but something created urgently, desperately, by someone racing against death. The manuscript bears witness to that race. The increasingly shaky handwriting, the pages filled to their margins, the sense of someone trying to get everything down before time ran out. He didn't succeed in getting everything down. The memoirs end in 1774, leaving 2.5 decades of his life unrecorded. Those final years at Dux, the decline into obscurity, the daily humiliations, the loneliness. He chose not to write about those, perhaps because nothing interesting happened worth recording, perhaps because it was too painful to confront how far he'd fallen. The ending we have feels abrupt. He's in Venice, involved in various schemes, and then the text simply stops. No conclusion, no summary, no final reflection. Just an ending that isn't really an ending. Some scholars speculate he intended to continue, but ran out of time or energy. Others argue the break was deliberate, that he wanted to end the story while there was still something to celebrate. Either way, we're left with an incomplete account of a life that resisted completion anyway. Casanova didn't resolve into a simple narrative. His contradictions remained unreconciled, his patterns unbroken, his restlessness unsatisfied. The memoir's structure reflects that. It doesn't progress toward enlightenment or wisdom. It circles back on itself, repeating themes and situations, showing someone who kept making the same mistakes, despite understanding them clearly. That repetition is part of the book's power. We watch him repeat patterns across decades, always convinced this time will be different. This woman will be the one. This scheme will finally provide security. And it never is. And she never is. And it never does. The tragedy isn't that he failed, it's that he understood he was failing while doing it anyway. His influence on literature extends beyond the memoirs themselves. Writers from Stendhal to Henry Miller drew on Casanova's example, finding in him a template for autobiographical fiction that blended fact and invention, that used personal experience as raw material for art. The confessional mode he pioneered, the willingness to expose himself without pretense of moral improvement, opened possibilities for later writers. But his broader cultural impact is harder to measure because it's been distorted by the myth. The word Casanova entered language as a synonym for seducer, but that flattens him into caricature. The actual person was stranger and more interesting than the archetype he inspired. Recovering him from beneath the layers of interpretation requires reading the complete memoirs, which most people never do. Those who do read them report a strange experience. The book is simultaneously fascinating and frustrating, brilliant and tedious, honest and self-serving. Casanova emerges as likable and infuriating, someone you admire and want to shake simultaneously. That complexity is precisely what the myth erases. The seducer archetype is simple. The actual person was not. His final years at Duck's Castle, which he barely mentions in the memoirs, represent the cruelest irony. He'd spent his life pursuing freedom, avoiding commitments, refusing to settle, and he ended up trapped in a provincial castle, dependent on someone else's charity, unable to leave because he had nowhere to go. The freedom he'd valued so highly led directly to the imprisonment of old age without resources or support. Whether he recognized that irony is unclear. The memoirs suggest he understood his life's patterns, but not necessarily their consequences. He saw what he was doing while doing it, but that awareness didn't translate into different choices. Self-knowledge without self-control, insight without change. His death at 73 came as a relief, probably. He'd been declining for years, his health failing, his mind still sharp but trapped in a deteriorating body. The memoirs gave him purpose during those final years, but finishing them left nothing. No project to complete, no reason to continue, just the waiting. The burial at Duck's should have been a footnote. A minor Italian librarian dies in a Bohemian castle, gets buried in the local cemetery, and that's the end. Except it wasn't the end, because the manuscript survived. Those thousands of pages written in fading ink, preserved through accident and intention, eventually making their way to publication, decades after his death. That publication, censored and distorted as it was, kept his name alive. Then the complete edition in 1960 revealed what had been hidden. The full complexity, the unvarnished honesty, the actual voice of someone who'd lived through the 18th century and remembered it all. The book ensured his survival in cultural memory, though not in the way he probably imagined. He wanted to be remembered as someone who'd lived freely, who'd seized opportunities, who'd experienced more than most people dream of. And he is remembered that way, but also as a cautionary tale, a symbol of both liberation and emptiness, freedom and its costs. The memoirs support both readings because both were true. What remains 2 centuries after his death is the text itself. Those 12 volumes containing a life in all its contradiction. The adventures and the humiliations, the triumphs and the failures, the brilliance and the stupidity. Casanova preserved in his own words, available to anyone willing to read them. Not the myth, but the man, complicated and human, and impossible to reduce to simple judgment. That's the real achievement. Not the life itself, which was remarkable, but also deeply flawed. The achievement was capturing that life in language, creating a record that would outlast memory and legend. The pages he filled in that lonely castle became his true immortality. The words survived when everything else disappeared. The story outlasted the facts. The book outlasted the body. The voice continued speaking long after the man fell silent. He died alone and was buried in an unmarked grave. But the manuscript endured, and through it so did he. A man who lived without apology, who pursued pleasure without restraint, who refused to be ordinary even when ordinariness would have served him better. Someone who understood himself clearly but couldn't change, who saw the patterns but repeated them anyway, who wrote it all down knowing we'd judge him, hoping we'd understand. We're still reading, still arguing about what his life means, still trying to separate the man from the myth. The conversation continues because the memoirs invite it, demand it, refuse to resolve into simple conclusions. Casanova achieved exactly what he wanted. We haven't forgotten him. His name endures, his story survives, his voice reaches across centuries. Not bad for an actor's son from Venice, who spent his final years filing books in a castle in Bohemia, racing against death to prove his life had mattered. He won that race. The words remain.